Okay, excellent. So I would like to try to finish off today Rav Sadigon's philosophical writings, his Emunah V'Deis, and maybe even move into the closing era of the Geonim. And we were working our way through his book of philosophy, which, as I've tried to show over the last few weeks, is a foundational philosophical text. Studied less, learnt less because of the sort of dominance that the Rambam's Moan of achieved, but enormously important. I think I created some confusion. There wasn't share last week, but 2 weeks ago, when I spoke when I shared Rav Sadigon's very strong feelings against the concept of Gilgul or reincarnation and the philosophical problems with this doctrine. Again, I have no ability to take sides, obviously, in this matter. It remains a machlokas between the Mekabalim, the Kabbalists, and the philosophers. But simply sharing that Sadigon, who is the first reference in Jewish literature to the concept, references it in order to dismiss it. So it's clearly an idea floating around in the Jewish world, and Sadigon dismisses it. I created a little bit of confusion because I want to be absolutely clear. This is a different doctrine to the concept of resurrection of the dead. This is the concept of Chasimas is of course one that Sadigon absolutely subscribes to. This is one of the Ikrei Emunah. Even long before the Rambam formulates his 13 principles of faith, the Mishnah in Chelek, at the ends of Sanhedrin, says that belief in Chasimas is essential, and without that, God forbid one loses one's portion in the world to come. The concept of resurrection of the dead is a very different concept to the concept of reincarnation. The philosophical problem of reincarnation is what if the person is reincarnated? Since there's no continuity of body or consciousness or awareness, the concept of resurrection, Chasimas, is a continuity of awareness and body. Someone is simply a consciousness is re-embodied with an awareness of its sense of continued identity and an awareness of being the continuity of the person. So philosophically, again, there may be no philosophical proofs for the concept, but philosophically, it's not. I'll come to another one. Philosophically, it's not a flawed philosophical concept. It's not one that should trouble a rationalist in and of in itself. If you believe that consciousness survives death. So again, we know little about the relationship between consciousness and the brain, consciousness and the body. But if you believe consciousness survives death, then there's no philosophical problem with life after death, with consciousness remaining after death, nor is there philosophical problem in principle with this consciousness being re-embodied. In other words, if your picture of consciousness is one in which the body is a tool or a vehicle to which consciousness is mediated, then in principle consciousness can survive post the cessation of that tool and can be re-embodied again, and this is the classic expression of Chasimas. Rav Sadigon is certainly not picking a fight with that. That's a Gemara, and Rav Sadigon absolutely accepts that, and indeed speaks about this in his work. His strong comments were addressed to the concept of reincarnation. Reincarnation is philosophically a problematic concept because reincarnation, we struggle to understand what is it that's reincarnated and where is it. And if there isn't a continuity of consciousness, and we simply mean somehow the soul is found there, in what way can the soul be found in a stone, in a cat, or indeed in another human being? And morally, does Gilgul, reincarnation, resolve any of the problems which it claims to resolve? So one of the arguments for reincarnation is it could explain the suffering of seemingly innocent people. You have, God forbid, a baby, a child that's suffering, and we struggle with that. How can it be that this innocent child is afflicted when it's done no wrong? And the answer is reincarnation. Well, what of the child, of this consciousness, wholly unaware of its previous life, is justifies this sort of moral punishment and the like. So it's there that Rav Sadigon disagrees with it. He doesn't disagree with the concept of Chasimas, resurrection of the dead, which we'll talk about in a moment. Sorry, Amrom. So there are. Avram is asking just those online. If you believe in reincarnation, which of the bodies will have Chasimas? There are a number of problems around Chasimas, including many questions, including if someone has multiple bodies, which will be reincarnated, perhaps multiple spouses in first and second and third marriages, how that will work. So there are many questions. I want to point out, though, that in a sense we all have multiple bodies, and there's anyway a philosophical question around resurrection, Chasimas. at what stage will the person be resurrected? Which point in their existence? Now, if they will be resurrected, as perhaps we might think, how they were when they died, moments before they died, then the consequence will be immediate death again, right? This is by definition. There's a reason why, sadly, the person died. Their body has reached a terminal point in its existence and is entering the stage of irrevocable breakdown. I'm not talking about maybe where a healthy person is in a crash or the like, but where there's a natural end of life process. So clearly, the person can't be resurrected at the moment of death, or they would simply die again. So in that sense, we all have multiple bodies. We all exist for multiple moments. Now, which moment in that existence will we be? Will we return to life? It's possible, and this may well have been the understanding of the Rambam, according to some of the commentaries on the Rambam, that we need to adjust our very sense of our understanding of consciousness and bodily form in order to understand the depth of resurrection of the dead. Arguably, one way to think about life is that every moment we are dying, second by second. Because Edward, please leave that talk because it won't close properly, and we'll get to the thing. Yeah, please go to it all the way around. Yeah. Okay. So, one way to think about death is that it is that the resurrection of the dead is that every moment we are dying moment by moment, and that moment has been lost. And when we talk about coming back to life, we mean every moment of existence will come back to life. I mean, in which case we're talking about a very altered state of consciousness. We're talking about a different sense of awareness. We currently live bound by time, and again, I'm not going to go into the philosophy of time now, which is a notoriously, and science of time, which is notoriously complicated. I'll simply say that at the moment we live bounded by time, in which, as every moment passes, that moment has ceased and has died. The concept of resurrection of the dead may be that if we return to life, if there's a resurrection of the dead, of death, then all moments of death come back to life. Arguably, therefore, we are in a different state of consciousness in which all our experiences are still lived experiences. You know, we may have engaged in. Let's talk about, for example, just for a moment, the concept of teshuvah. So a failure that we did many years ago maybe feel like it's very much in the past. Our memories of it have faded. It's sort of drifted away from our conscious awareness. And yet the concept of culpability and responsibility means that on some level we are still responsible for this. This is still part of our makeup. So we can argue that in a sense that aspect of our makeup has died, has disappeared, we're not aware of it, and that will come to life. And this sort of may tie into the concept of Yom Hadin HaGadol alluded to in the Nevi'im, that ultimately we stand responsible for everything we've ever done, including those moments which have died, in other words, those moments which are past. So I'm not claiming that the concept of resurrection of the dead doesn't have philosophical problems to it. But I don't know if the issue of multiple bodies is a knockout blow for reincarnation. It may simply be an extended period of life. So you live for your 100 years on Earth in body A, then you live for your next 100 years in body B, if you believe in reincarnation, and then those 200 years come back to life. So the philosophical problem of 200 years coming back to life is no more of a philosophical problem than 100 years coming back to life. All these ideas are difficult to comprehend. Either way, in terms of Rav Saadia Gaon, he doesn't believe in reincarnation, but absolutely does believe in resurrection of the dead. And after Shira, it became apparent to me last time that that distinction wasn't apparent to everyone. Yes. Yes.
For the consciousness,
Yes.
resurrection versus incarnation. It says that.
So the brief answer is listen to the recording of the previous show, which is online. But there are both resurrection of the dead and reincarnation are difficult ideas, no doubt. In Rav Sadia's view, and we can argue this, I think it's an important distinction. Resurrection of the dead simply means that if you are a believer in the survival of consciousness post-death, which I spoke about also in that year, in other words, the idea that consciousness isn't an emergent property from physical existence, but mediates through physical existence. And when we see the decline of consciousness with the decline of physical existence, what we're seeing is a decline of the interface, but not of consciousness itself. Right? The parable of humans born with goggles over their eyes. And we notice that. Imagine all humans are born with goggles. That would just be our biology, that over our eyes are goggles, right? And we notice as we journey through life that the goggles become scratched and deteriorated, and with that, our vision deteriorates. And someone argues that were we to remove the goggles, vision would be restored back to full clarity. We would say that's ridiculous. Clearly, vision emerges from the goggles, and if the deterioration of the goggles leads to deterioration of vision, kal v'chomer, how much more so the removal of the goggles, the destruction of the goggles, would lead to removal of vision. But it isn't like that. The goggles are merely an interface, and with the removal of the interface, vision is restored. So we don't know what the relationship between consciousness and our bodies are. We assume in the West, in the sort of secular materialist West, that with the destruction of the body is the destruction of consciousness. This is a philosophical mistake. It's simply an assumption. And the Jewish position is equally philosophically justifiable, in which we don't know that much about the relationship between consciousness and the body, the mind-body dilemma, like duality. These are all remaining lingering philosophical problems. And therefore, it's perfectly conceivable that the body is an interface through which consciousness operates, and therefore, in the same way as consciousness once operated through a physical body, it can do so a second time, and there shouldn't be a problem with that idea. The difficulty with reincarnation, on the other hand, is that there appears to be no survival of consciousness, because the reincarnated person in general, unless you believe the claims of some mystics, is unaware of their previous life, in which case we don't really understand what is it that's transmitted onwards. And we don't really know in what way the previous existence of the soul is somehow present in the new soul, particularly if you're talking about souls that become embodied in other forms. If you talk about a stone that becomes embodied in an animal, a stone that becomes embodied in a soul that becomes embodied in an animal, a soul that becomes embodied in a stone, in what way is the soul present in the stone? Where is it present? Now, I'm not saying there are no answers to these questions. There are serious Kabbalists that believe in these ideas and have a depth of philosophical understanding, whereas Gaon isn't willing to go with this and doesn't believe this has any traditional Jewish sources. And we don't find any Jewish sources for the idea. Till Rav Gaon, he's the first, to the best of my knowledge, the first source to reference this concept, and we don't find it in Chazal mentioned anywhere. There are Chazals which the Kabbalists later argue can be understood to be referring to the doctrine of Gilgul. It's not explicit anywhere in Chazal, it's not explicit in any psukim in the Torah, and Rav Gaon therefore says he doesn't know where this belief comes from. He doesn't think this is a Jewish belief, and the Kabbalists disagree. Okay, so this is, I suppose, just a little bit of chazara on last time, 2 weeks ago, and a clarification. The Gaon certainly believes in resurrection of the dead. I suppose continuing swiftly forward, therefore, just to run through some of the next chapters. Rav Gaon believes in reward and punishment. He speaks about free will. Despite Hashem's foreknowledge, we nonetheless have free will. God's foreknowledge doesn't cause us to act in a particular way. It's compatible to say both that he knows what's going to happen and that his knowledge doesn't cause us to act in the way that we do. Just because I know how you're going to behave doesn't mean I am the cause of your behavior. Whether that is a sufficient distinction or not, we can debate. Rambam, Maimonides, doesn't think it's a sufficient distinction and doesn't think this works, but Rav Gaon suffices with that. He says reward and punishment are essential for justice. It's an interesting thing. I think I may have mentioned this last time, but if we believe that it is good to be good, that we ought to be good, then reward and punishment, in a sense, should be irrelevant to that. Whether we continue to exist, it's a very interesting thing, because if you ask a lot of people, why do you do that which is right? Why do you keep mitzvahs and the like? Well, so well, because I want to have on my bar, I want to be rewarded, I don't want to be punished. And the problem with that approach is twofold. The first is it's very transactional. It isn't transcendent. It isn't spiritual in a sense. It's merely transactional. So I need to do all sorts of things in my life in order to prosper. I need to work in order to get paid a salary. I need to pay money to the shop in order to get food. And I need to do mitzvahs in order to get God to grant me spiritual food or the like. It's not a genuine relationship. That isn't the stuff of which relationships are built. More than that, it turns out I am in a sense no more transcendent, spiritual or moral than any other individual who lives with no awareness of God in their lives and no attempt to live a spiritual life. They are simply misinformed. They're scientifically misinformed. They think that the greatest pleasure in life is a beef burger, a hamburger. I'm lucky enough to know the greatest pleasure in life is the reward in the world to come. So I'm the same as the person who dedicates their life to pursuit of the best cheeseburger. Simply, I'm better informed. So You have person A who thinks the greatest pleasure in life is cheeseburgers, person B who thinks the greatest pleasure in life is classical music, so they're slightly more sophisticated and aware of slightly higher pleasures, and person C who realizes there's only bar. But fundamentally, we're not different creatures. We are simply all three of us engaged in the pursuit of selfish pleasure for our own material goals and our own material ends. So the transactional model is flawed and limited. Gaon thinks it's okay as a model if that's what gets society to behave well. So he thinks that the Torah's doctrine of reward and punishment is a useful means. At the end of the day, we have to be realists, and a good way to build society is to promise people reward and punishment. But nonetheless, that's not true spirituality. True spirituality is found in doing that which is right and proper and good, because it's right and proper and good. In theory, Gaon doesn't believe this, but in theory, were we to think there was no reward and punishment, we still ought to live a good and meaningful life, because if it's good to be good, we should do so irrespective of reward and punishment. Would it suddenly become okay to if you're attempting to cross the road and ahead of you is a person struggling to carry a little old lady struggling to carry her shopping bag, would it be okay to shove her out of the way? Were we to live in a world without reward and punishment, would it not be morally right to still help her with her shopping across the road? Why would that be affected by reward and punishment? Surely, if something is moral or immoral, if something is proper and appropriate or not, surely if something is spiritual, transcendent, that's the sort of thing we ought to do, irrespective of reward and punishment. Nonetheless, says Rav Gaon, we do believe in reward and punishment because there is something incomplete in a world in which there is injustice, and reward and punishment is the only way to restore justice. And more than that, we need to understand reward and punishment in a more subtle way. We need to understand that reward and punishment is closeness or distance from God. Meaning to say, at the moment now, we live in a morally cloudy universe in which we don't always feel, and we're not always aware of the gift of existence of behaving in a moral way. We can do moral behavior and find it painful or unpleasant or think that we are paying a price for so doing. We can do immoral behavior and feel that we prosper as a result of that. But in truth, once the illusion is stripped away from us, we understand that true fulfillment and true pleasure is found in godliness and closeness to God, and that the pain of moral failure is found in distance from morality. And therefore, we should think of reward and punishment as the depth of despair and pain in distance from that which is right, in distance from God, and reward in the intense fulfillment and pleasure, spiritual pleasure of closeness to God. So let me just summarize what we've said, because we've thrown in quite a lot. Rav Gaon thinks that reward and punishment ought not, in essence, to really be relevant to moral decision making. If you're meant to be moral, you should be moral irrespective of reward and punishment. Number two, reward and punishment as a motive for actions is transactional. It's not true transcendence. Number three, nonetheless, it's better than the alternative. In other words, it's a reasonable way to build a society on expectation of reward and punishment, as long as it's true, and Rav Gaon, of course, does think it's true. It's a sensible way to motivate people, and therefore he thinks that's a justification for the Torah speaking about reward and punishment. And number four, he does believe in reward and punishment, but sees reward and punishment as closeness or distance from God. Now, I want to emphasize that sometimes when people hear this, they think, well, I can do without being close to God. So, okay, I mean, that's, I thought we were going to get fantastic reward, and all it is closeness to God or distance from God. But of course, the point is that is, in Rav Gaon's thinking, the greatest pleasure and reward possible, and the worst punishment possible. If I can use an example from this, if we can think about psychological fulfillment and despair just as an analogy for a moment, if someone looks back, and which of us don't in our own limited way, we look back on our lives and we see areas of failure, areas in which we didn't live up to our highest standards, areas in which we didn't achieve that which we could have achieved and ought to have achieved and the like. One can feel an intense sense of despair, and that can be, in a sense, more painful than any physical pain, perhaps. And similarly, when we look back on the moments in our lives where we did productive, good things, and we achieved positive outcomes, the fulfillment in that is exceptional and intense and positive. So the idea that sort of physical, maybe as a child, and sort of pictures Gan Eden and Geonim as physical pain and physical punishment, and we think, well, oh, okay, Sadiq saying that all it is some form of spiritual punishment. That's not so bad. But not at all. Actually, we are willing to put ourselves through considerable physical suffering in order to achieve things of worth. We're willing to pay a considerable price in terms of physical pain and pleasure in order to live a fulfilling life, one in which we actually achieve things that we wish to achieve. Think of the scientist or the doctor or the researcher who spends hours late into the night and pushes themselves to the limit to achieve outcomes which they hope will be productive for humanity. The author, the poet, the composer. Think of the sports celebrity who puts themselves through years of pain, literally physical pain, of pushing themselves to the limit, and exceptional diets and getting up early in the morning and working exceptionally hard in order to achieve something of no particular physical pleasure, but the outcome of being able to stand on the podium with that gold medal and feel, perhaps an illusory feeling that they've achieved something that's of absolute worth. When they're standing on the podium, they feel they have touched infinity. They've become one of the greats. They've become one of the gods. I'm now, even that's an illusion, of course. But they feel, I've entered the record books. I've achieved something of worth for all time. So we see that the achievement of transcendence, the achievement of something of worth for all time, is something that outweighs any physical pain, and it beats any physical pleasure. And of course, this is an illusory achievement of real worth and so on. But something genuinely, this person who makes the decision to help that elderly person across the roads with their shopping bag has done something greater than that gold medal. And that's the depth of reward and management. Please do not hear in anything. If anyone is coming out of this saying, okay, so Onam Abba, it's not so great, the reward is not so brilliant, and the punishment's not so bad, then please, you have misunderstood me. Go back to level 1 of Rav Saadia's understanding, in which she says this is a great motivator for morality. But Rav Saadia Gaon's point is the point that we do need to reflect upon, that if something is good and worthwhile, then it ought to be done, no matter whether there is reward and punishment. I also refer you to Rav Saadia Gaon's earlier chapter, in which he argues that mitzvahs are all good and Averos are all bad. There's mitzvahs which are obviously good and bad to us. Don't murder, do tzedakah, do charity, welcome guests. There are mitzvahs which are less obviously, so shatnez and kashrus, but he argues that they all ultimately, I'll come to a moment, he argues that they all ultimately lead to reward, and they all ultimately lead to good and bad, and therefore they all fall within this rubric. Sorry, yes.
References living by a life, recognise the reward and punishment, but you actually have some kind of concept of what the parameters are, or can in fact you operate on the basis of your own instinctive?
Okay, so the question being asked is to what degree can we instinctively know what's good and bad? Do we need revelation? And this is a very important point that Rav Saadia Gaon talks about earlier in his book, which I think I referenced a few weeks back, which is if as soon as you enter into philosophical discourse, as soon as you become part of that Arab-Greek conversation in which you're aware of the Greek greats, this Aristotle, Plato being created by the Arab transmitters of philosophy, and you believe that reason can reveal truths, you have this problem. Why do we need revelation? Why do we need Torah? Surely we humans should reflect and work out what is good and what's not good. And Rav Saadia Gaon's answer to that is that indeed reason can get you so far, but revelation is needed still to get you further. And it could be there's unique individuals that can achieve clarity about what's good and what's bad without revelation, but certainly the average person can't do so, and therefore we need revelation to tell us. But in principle, if you find yourself on a desert island, unable to access a single halachic work, with no knowledge of halacha, you are my favorite example, the Mongolian goat herd who has never heard of Sinai, never heard of revelation, and you're trying to live a good life, there is still a moral expectation on you to do so, to use your God-given faculties of reason to arrive at some approximation of good and evil, but you may struggle to get the boundaries right. You may struggle to know the details. For example, all humans may agree that murder is wrong. Needless cessation of life is wrong. But what defines needless? Is it okay to put babies outside your Spartan town in order to protect society? And what defines the beginning of life and end of life? Cessation of human life needlessly is wrong, but what cause justifies it? And what point does life start? The abortion debate. What point does life end? The end of life debate. These are questions that maybe without revelation we wouldn't be able to answer. Yeah.
So firstly, the implication being that Torah is revelation of moral.
Yes.
Definition of moral value. but there is a moral
Yes,
reality outside of which predates, as it were, revelation.
yes, yes. And this is something we've discussed in much earlier series. I think over COVID, the relationship between morality and revelation. At the time, I did mention, people may not remember, I did mention Masadi Gaon on this at the time also. Yeah.
So how would the compare the Sadi Gaon's philosophy here on the, if it's regard to, for example, Rambam, as Rambam?
So the Rambam, in some ways, of what I've said in the name of Saadia Gaon is quite similar to what the Rambam says. The Saadia seems more okay with a transactional relationship also, if that's where you're up to. He's not as dismissive of it. He thinks that's a good life to live. The Rambam considers that somewhat worthless. And the Rambam sharpens some of these formulations of Rav Saadia Gaon. Many of the ideas that Rav Saadia Gaon touches upon, the Rambam tidies up. So again, Rav Saadia Gaon, for example, as I mentioned, speaks about free will and divine foreknowledge, but stops with simply saying a version of knowledge isn't the same as causality, and therefore God can know without causing. And the Rambam takes that much further and unpicks what he sees as holes in that reasoning. Okay, so just to summarize, Rav Saadia says that Rav Saadia is the thinker that, again, in this sense, it's not new, but he formalizes it. He says the soul is spiritual, it's immortal, it's distinct from the body, it survives death, it retains consciousness and awareness. These aren't things that are clearly said earlier in Chazal, even though they're there in Chazal. But we don't find the Chazal that talks sort of overtly about what exactly the neshama is. He speaks about the idea that righteous souls experience and enjoy closeness to God, wicked souls are distanced from God, and that is some form of conscious pain and conscious pleasure. And he also emphasizes that, which I think, again, the Rambam doesn't emphasize so much, but I think it is a very important point, that reward and punishment is necessary to live in a just world. In other words, were the wicked to go unpunished, there would be a moral problem in that. We would be living in an unjust world. So we need morality is a hard thing to define, and I'm not going to attempt to do so in this conversation. But there is a moral repugnance at the idea of someone living immorally and getting away with it. The Rambam seems to be of the belief. Here's another Rambam Saadia Gaon distinction in this, that the Rambam seems to understand that rather than thinking about wickedness as leading to distance from God, we should think of wickedness as decay of consciousness, as non-existence. Let me try and explain what I mean by that. A human being with a mind, an elevated spiritual and conceptual mind, we can understand what survives after death of the human being, their reason, their consciousness, their mind. What survives of a cow after death? So if a cow's whole existence, I don't know much about cow psychology and cow consciousness, but I'm going to assume for the sake of this conversation that a cow's awareness is limited to very base physical pleasures, right? It likes juicy grass. It doesn't like being in a field without any grass and so on. In other words, consciousness is limited to bodily awareness. So what survives of the cow after death? And the answer is nothing. There is nothing to survive because its whole consciousness is intertwined with physicality. This is my Maimonidean point. So Maimonides, the Rambam, views wickedness as turning yourself from a human into a cow. A wicked human is the Rambam turns spirituality inwards in a sense, because and this is a problem in the Rambam's thinking. And I'm not going to go into this problem, but you will notice in a much Jewish discourse, we mix these two concepts and we don't unpick the difference. And I know myself, when I have an 8-minute drasha to give in shul and I learn time for sophisticated philosophy, I often blur this issue. To what degree is spiritual and morality about self-development, and to what degree is about achieving something external in making the world into a better place? And there is a tension between the two, because you can imagine scenarios in which you are making the world a better place, but you're not spiritually developing yourself. And you can imagine spirituality as making myself into a better person, a more moral person, but that can become somewhat self-centered and selfish. The Rambam, in many respects, heads very much towards the internal self-development model. And the Rambam says that spirituality is, in a sense, one way of thinking about spirituality is developing yourself to become a conscious being, and a high level of consciousness, which isn't trapped in bodily functions and bodily pleasures. Therefore, the Rambam says that when you die, in a sense, one way of thinking about reward and punishment and the Torah says this again, it says, choose life, choose to live. Choosing to be a spiritual person is choosing to live because you live in the world of ideas and spiritual concepts rather than just in a bodily world. If you choose to debase yourself and just become a physical animal, a human being whose pleasures and pains in life are that of a cow, what is there in you to survive? This is how the Rambam understands Koris, cessation of life, post of the ones that talks about certain areas that lead to creases, to spiritual excision. The Rambam understands that to mean cessation of self. There is nothing in you that's left to survive. You have engaged in such a morally destructive act that what is there in you that's left to survive? Now, I want to point out two problems with. Are you with me in this, gentlemen and ladies? Ladies here today, okay. You with me online? Are you with me in this? There are two problems with the Maimonidean vision. The first is that it leaves out external achievements in a sense. It's all about internal development, and there's a tension between the two. Now, of course, to be an internally developed person, you have to care about others. But in a sense, all of this is just a means to really developing yourself. And the Rambam lived with this tension. What made the Rambam the Rambam said views which, in many senses, many respects, were quite shocking to people around him. And to this day, if we think about some of the ideas the Rambam says, that there are aspects that are shocking about what he said. What kept the Rambam, in a sense, within the fold is because he bowed to halacha. The Rambam, in and of in himself, felt that his best and greatest spiritual achievement would have been had he been able to lock himself in a room and engage in meditative and philosophical contemplation. But that isn't how the Rambam lived. He lived his life of dedication to the community and involvement with the world. He engaged in as a doctor. He was a communal leader. He raised a family. He did all the classic Jewish things of involvement with regular life. But that isn't really what he saw as the good life. In many respects, he saw all of these as accommodation to need and human weakness. In principle, he saw the monastic life as an elevated life, a life that doesn't draw you into these mundane affairs. But that isn't what halacha allows us to do. We have to become drawn into these things when the demands on our time. But in a sense, he bemoans that. And he lived with that tension of, I have to be a moral person, and that demands of me, therefore, to spend. And he describes his day in a very moving letter to a student he never met, a student in distant shores in Provence, who wished to meet him and was wowed by the Rambam's philosophical works. And the Rambam says, "You don't understand. You read me and think I'm engaged in philosophical contemplation. But I don't have time to do that. I get up early in the morning and I go straight off to the King's Palace where I engage as a doctor, and then I come home and immediately I'm besieged by communal people who need me and so on, and I don't get till late at night. I don't manage to eat supper and do anything, and that's my day after day after day." But the Rambam sees this as a sacrifice of his fullest spiritual and moral development because the Torah demands of us to care for others and to live a moral life. So there is a kind of unresolved tension in the Rambam over there, which Rav Gaon doesn't have to grapple with. And more than that, the Rambam shocked people by saying that ultimate wickedness is rewarded with, is punished with non-existence, because there seems to be an injustice in that. If you live a thoroughly wicked life and you cease to exist without any pain and suffering, there seems to be a moral injustice in that, because, well, you just end. So, okay, you just end. Now, the Rambam would say that what a loss for this person who could have had eternal consciousness and eternal life and hasn't. But others would argue that there's an injustice in this. Now, Gaon is conscious of that injustice, and he says there needs to be reward and punishment in order to restore the world into a type of equilibrium. There's a repugnance, a moral repugnance. It feels morally wrong to think that God would create a universe in which someone can live a thoroughly wicked life and then get away with it. Is cessation of existence getting away with it or not? Okay, we can argue till the cows come home, but Rav Gaon sees reward and punishment as a moral necessity for a just universe. Is this? Are people with me in all this? Or yeah, yes. Yes.
That is that there are clear murderers, evil people.
Yes.
They will get consciously a free pass in this life.
Yes.
In order that they stop fighting, for example, whether it's
Yes.
Iran or whether it's
Hamas. Yes.
that's potentially an issue which we have to address.
So I don't want to go into the too much detail of this, other than to say, this shouldn't be news to any of us that in Olam Hazeh, in the physical life, we live in an unfair world, 100%. And yes, the idea of murderers getting a free pass, getting a what's it called, sorry, pardon of sorts, yeah, is morally abhorrent, and it may nonetheless be the best thing to do as a solution to ending war. Or to, again, I'm not commenting on the wrongs and rights of it. Everyone will have their own political and moral views. This gets us into political philosophy and the like, separate area. But yes, it is morally repugnant and may nonetheless be a necessary evil. And we live in a world where we don't see, the psalmist, right? Why do the wicked prosper? And this is the stuff of Eov. This is the stuff of Tehillim. This is certainly a problem. Our answer to that would be enochnomi. You're right. It's morally repugnant. It may nonetheless be worth it if that's what's necessary to rebuild society. And they are osid litin es adin. They will stand one day in judgment in front of their creator, and they will suffer for the consequences of what they did. And this is Rav Sadikon's point about spiritual justice, and that's necessary to live in a reasonable world. That reason dictates that there ought to be justice. And I think Rav Sadikon wasn't aware of the later Maimonidean doctrine of cessation of existence, and probably would have disagreed with it. Whether the Rambam meant that or not, again, is a subject of debate, by the way. I should emphasize, Rambam's idea that there's complete non-existence as an outcome it's controversial whether it's controversial whether the Rambam said this or not, but at least one reading of the Rambam, by the way, not in Moed Nevuchim, in the Mishnah Torah. One reading of the Rambam in his Mishnah Torah is that wickedness ends up in non-existence, and this was one of the big controversies, Maimonidean controversies around that idea, because it seems to repudiate the idea of reward and punishment. Is non-existence a punishment of sorts? Yes.
The Rambam notion that according to the Rambam, crime punishment is somewhat built into the natural order of it. So it's not just surviving some end of life. But that the world is not the way, has a way of dealing with wickedness.
Yes.
Yes. Wickedness. But I wonder how the Gaon will think about the same idea.
I'm not aware of something on going down that Maimonidean path. And the question was about the Rambam's idea that reward and punishment is built into the nature and fabric of society and the workings of the world. I don't know. I don't think the Gaon says that. Okay, I'd like to try and today finish off his other thoughts. We may actually even finish here a little early today, because that's something I still need to do before the next year. So the remaining chapters, Rav Sadigan speaks, as I said, about survival of the soul after death. He speaks about Chias HaMesim. He believes that resurrection is clear in the Psukim, unlike reincarnation, which isn't. He doesn't see anything philosophically problematic with it. In the same way as God can create consciousness and life a first time, he can embody consciousness in a body for a second time, and more than that, he believes that resurrection is demanded morally, because since the body partook of good and bad, even the body needs reward and punishment. Very interesting idea. Even the body needs reward and punishment, because a person is an embodied consciousness, and therefore it would be unjust for the neshama, the soul, the consciousness, to be punished and rewarded. Even the body needs to be rewarded and punished. This is in line again with Rav Sadigan's view that there's a moral repugnance, a moral injustice that's at work over here, and therefore if the soul needs to be rewarded and punished, the soul gets the true reward and punishment of closeness to God, but the body also needs to be rewarded and punished. It seems, therefore, in Rav Sadigan's thinking, that the body isn't just a passive implement of the consciousness, but the body is a partner in human consciousness. And this definitely aligns with much of modern thinking about consciousness, in which we are embodied consciousnesses, and consciousness is an embodied experience in some way or other. And he believes this is part of the purpose of the Messianic era. So to summarize, reincarnation doesn't go with resurrection. He does. He sees that as justice, as a principle of justice. More fully than that, he sees reward and punishment in Olam Haba, the spiritual world of reward and punishment, as a moral and principle of justice. He also sees this as a necessary motivator of human beings. He's a pragmatist. Humans need motivation, and there's no harm in reward and punishment being motivation. But the true reason to do morally good things is because it's moral and right to do so, not because of reward and punishment. He writes about Moshiach and says things which are very much a standard part of our belief and were recorded by the Rambam in his Principles of Faith. The Moshiach Mashiach will be a human leader from the line of David, that with Mashiach coming, there'll be end of exile, the restoration of Klal Yisrael, universal recognition of God, and that the Mashiach process will include Nissim, signs, and eventual peace. And again, he sees this as rationally necessary because history has to culminate in moral and spiritual perfection. Again, let's just pause for a few moments. Who cares whether the Mashiach will come or not? How should that affect us? Imagine we knew that Mashiach will never come. Would that affect any of our decision-making processes? How would it affect it? Why should it affect it? If what I'm doing is right because it's right, well then again, why is Mashiach relevant? Why, we believe in Mashiach, fine, but why is it a principle of faith according to the Rambam? Who cares? Why does it matter? Right? Okay, Mashiach will come. Let's see what history brings. Why should we think so much about it? And it's interesting, by the way, within much of the Orthodox world, other than, of course, the famous exception of Chabad, we believe in Mashiach coming. We don't spend a lot of time talking about it. Why should we spend a lot of time talking about it? When it comes, it comes. And until then, it doesn't come. We haven't had good experience, by the way, with over messianic ambitions, right? I'm talking about, obviously, the founding of Christianity. I'm talking about the Shabbos debacle. I'm talking about some of the events in Chabad in more recent years. I'm arguing about streams of messianic religious Zionism. What do we really gain by that conversation? So, the founding of the state of Israel, is Aschalta de Geula? Isn't Aschalta de Geula? Is that so important? Is it so relevant? If it's the good thing to do, if this is a productive step in the Jewish journey and productive and important in our physical safety and our spiritual development, do we need to obsess about it? Now, again, I'm not saying there are no answers to these questions, and I'll give you the floor in a moment, but the question is one that deserves to be asked, and I can definitely understand why there are dangers in overemphasis. So Rav Gaon deals with this, and he says, no, he believes that history has, again, the same principle of justice. History has to culminate in something. It has to culminate in moral and spiritual perfection. There has to be the human revolt at the idea of things not making sense. Stories have to make sense. There has to be a narrative that strings together. Meaning is found in direction of travel and in culmination and in a positive outcome. And without that, there's imagine we all knew that this is it. We would, Jews would have good times and bad times. We'd have diaspora times and times in the lands of Israel, and history would go in waves. No country survives forever. No kingdom survives forever. No civilization survives forever. And we would carry plodding on in a good way, doing chesed, doing good things, doing morally thing. And this would be the situation in 1,000 years, in 5,000 years, and in 50,000 years. So some of you may be sitting thinking that that's a terrible thought, and others of you may be thinking, okay, that's life. That's how things go. So Rav Gaon is bothered by that, and he says, no, there is a rational philosophical reason to understand that history has to head somewhere, has to go somewhere, and therefore he argues that belief in Mashiach is a rational and philosophical necessity, not just a principle of revealed faith. Sorry, Avram, you're looking very disturbing. Yeah.
And that has to impact on our practical behavior and what we do. So it doesn't indicate, it has practical day-to-day implications. It's not a theory.
Okay, so I'll say 2 points. Amrom is asking, if the Rabbanu Shver is Mashiach, if the state of Israel is Achai to the practical implications, maybe yes, maybe not. Right, and that's the point, really. Though you could argue yes, because obviously then I would question a little bit the pushback on that is in what way exactly. In other words, if at every stage in your life you have to make reasonable decisions and good decisions, where this is heading in 20, 30, 50, 150 years' time is not necessarily exactly the point. I assume that when Mashiach comes, we'll all be aware of that, we'll all realize, and that will then affect our judgment calls. Until that point, what do we gain by sort of trying to... History is notoriously hard to read. History is hard to read in the past, to extrapolate to the future. So what do we gain by trying to read the tea leaves of history? And the project of trying to hasten the coming of Mashiach has often ended in failure. And this is meant to be philosophy, but I'm allowed to voice current views also. I think there are aspects of the Messianic ideology that were problematic from the start that are somewhat playing out in Israel now, and I think we can all see some of those. And I'm not sure that utopian dreams ever are healthy for humans. In my view, they often lead to irrational behavior. I'm in that sense, again, I'm just being personal here. I'm very suspicious of big picture thinkers. I think big ideologies, communism and fascism, and I'm not comparing messianism to either of those, God forbid, but I'm suspicious of people that sort of read history and have big picture thinking. And in my view, it often leads to foolish behavior. I'm saying this, by the way, in other areas, the inevitable rise of Islamism in the West and so on. Who knows? Demographics are complicated, assimilation is complicated, social trends are complicated. There's 1,000 factors. I can't predict what I'm going to say in 5 minutes' time. Like Kal v'chomer, just think of the complexity of reading demographics and society and so on. One needs to be sensible. One needs to engage in some form of modeling. One needs to take precautionary action. But again, I remember, I'm old enough to remember the fall of the Iron Curtain, and to the best of my recollection, I remember the euphoria that swept the globe when 60 countries, I think, became democracies in 1 year. I don't, and it was literally the swords being beaten into plowshares. It was the end of history and peace. I don't remember any of the wise people talking about the rise of fundamentalist Islam, of Islamism, and the next battles that would confront the West. I don't remember China being at the time, spoken of as this great threat. Now, I'm suspicious, therefore, equally of talking heads to this day, and the idea that people can assert with any great confidence about where history is heading. That's my personal take on it. My personal take is that big picture, that sort of big picture, utopian or messianic, or catastrophic, by the way, the other way around also often leads to poor decision making. Again, different people in this room will have different views around some of the environmental predictions. It obviously makes sense for a sensible person to be aware of damage to the environment. It obviously makes sense for a sensible person to be aware of pollution and to take steps. And within this room, we might all disagree about what steps one takes and how one does so. But I don't think sort of big mapping of catastrophes. The ecosystems are notoriously complicated. It's very, very hard to make this big picture thinking. Again, I'm not asking anyone to accept my view on this. This is not rabbinic thinking particularly. I'm simply saying that the questions are worth asking, and therefore, similarly, Moshiach is the closest we come to that sort of big thinking big picture thinking. And I'm questioning, why is it necessary? Surely we should continue to do that which is right because it's right at each stage in our lives. And by the way, nothing I've said is meant as a dig at religious Zionism or Chabad for that. They're wonderful, wonderful movements. And God forbid, I in no sense, I'm simply saying that on occasion these movements can give rise to players that abuse these concepts. There is a danger in these ideas. I'm not, God forbid, criticizing the ideas themselves, but there are dangers in this type of big picture thinking. And Rav Gaon raises the question as to the purpose of Mashiach, and he gives an answer to that question. He believes it's necessary for a just universe within which we live. Yeah.
Point of view, when you say Seif Machshav Machshava Tchila,
yes,
HaKadosh Baruch Hu designed the world where there
yes,
has to be an end point. So there is that Mashiach point looks like to be the end point. It could seem to be the end point of the whole reason why Hashem created the world. So just to say that, we go along with it, and so I'm not so sure we shouldn't be wanting it in that respect, because that's how much problems you.
Okay, so I want to say three things briefly. First of all, God is allowed to think in big picture thinking. Everything I'm saying is that us human beings, of course, God is allowed big picture thinking. Secondly, I'm not saying that we shouldn't long for it and want it. 100% we should long for it and want it. I'm simply saying, imagine a world in which we would never achieve our aspiration of a perfected world. Would it therefore be pointless to try and make the world a little bit better? That's the question I'm asking. And imagine we knew that in 1,000 years, 5,000 years, 50,000 years, we would never achieve this outcome, this perfected world. Why would that affect my decision today and tomorrow to try and make the world a little bit more perfect for the people that currently live within it? In what way would it change my thinking? Again, I want to emphasize, learners, I'm not here, chas v'shalom, questioning the doctrine of faith of the Ikonon of Mashiach. I'm not challenging it. I'm not saying we shouldn't long for it. But there is a philosophical question we need to ask ourselves, which is, why does it matter? And there may be answers to that question. Well, Gaon in many ways is answering like you. He's saying that history that doesn't achieve an outcome has a meaninglessness to it. There's something unjust in it. There's something pointless in it. It's an interesting answer, and I think we could try and unpick that answer in this series. I'm not particularly attempting to challenge Rav Gaon either, but question asked, and his view, question answered. I'm simply saying, to me, it's a question we often don't ask, and I think we miss something by not asking that question. And then each person will find their own answer to that question. Yeah.
Just that, Rav Gaon saying that you need this messianic conclusion.
Yes.
Or conclusion to agree. Or is he saying also that people along the way need that, is not to be directed
Both.
to the right way?
Both. He's pragmatic, in which he says people need the doctrine of reward and punishment, and he's philosophically, yes, and he's philosophically minded because he says that there is something unjust, inappropriate, morally repugnant. I can only use that term because it's quite hard to define exactly philosophically what we mean, but there's something abhorrent, morally wrong about the idea of history, there's a pointlessness, a meaninglessness, which Leonard is expressing, to history not going anywhere, not heading anywhere. There needs to be a plan, as Sof Martin much other two things.
In that context, people need that.
We need it to sustain, but more than that, it's more. He believes it's philosophically, it's both. It's needed psychologically, but also he believes it's philosophically correct. Yeah. Okay, we've finished for my point of view what I wanted to say about Rav Saadia Gaon's thoughts, and next year will be, please God, the final year in which we'll look at the end of the Gaonic era. I'm feeling a little bit wistful as I say that. We spent so long with the Geonim in this series, and I'll try to cover the closing Geonim of Chofni Gaon, the great Rav Sherira Gaon, the great Rav Achai Gaon, and if we have time, also talk about the transition from the era of the Geonim into the era of the Rishonim. As I'm speaking, I'm thinking maybe a touch optimistic to do that all in one year, but we'll see. We'll see what we manage next Sunday, and. For those who like history more than philosophy, the next few shiurim will be, next year at least, will be more historic than philosophical. And with that, we will move on. I'm open, by the way, to nominations for subjects other than the Geonim as we move on to our next topic. So please feel able to share ideas and so on. I wish everyone a good day. Thank you so much for joining, as always.
Thank you. Thank you.